February 3rd, 2025. 2:47 a.m. Eastern Time. One social media post, $27 trillion, vanished from global markets in 72 hours. NATO's financial backbone cracked wide open. European central banks scrambling in emergency sessions. The dollar's reign suddenly questioned by 31 nations. But here's what they're not telling you. This wasn't just a post. It was a calculated demolition of the post-war economic order. And what happens next will determine if your savings survive the next 90 days. Welcome to Currency Archive. If you've been navigating financial markets long enough to remember when a handshake actually meant something, then you understand why this channel exists. We don't chase headlines, we decode the strategies behind them. If you value that approach, a quiet click on the subscribe button tells us you're still in the fight. And tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from today? Because this story, it's unfolding differently depending on which side of the Atlantic you're standing. At precisely 2:47 in the morning, Donald Trump published something that didn't simply upset America's partners. It shattered the entire Western financial structure that had held the global economy together for decades. Analysts are discussing a $27 trillion institutional framework that has provided worldwide stability since the Bretton Woods Agreement. And here's the critical detail that mainstream coverage is completely missing. This wasn't an emotional outburst. This was a deliberately planned legal and economic attack that prosecutors must recognize as witness intimidation operating at a geopolitical level. What unfolded during the following 72 hours should deeply concern anyone who comprehends how actual power functions in the modern world. The public narrative and the prosecutorial reality exist in completely different universes. Let observers examine what truly occurred. On January 23rd at 2:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Trump posted on Truth Social demanding that NATO member nations pay their outstanding debts or face serious consequences. America would decide the response unilaterally, he declared. Most analysts dismissed this as standard Trump aggressive rhetoric. They were completely wrong. Within just 6 hours, 3 specific events occurred that prosecutors would immediately identify as coordinated institutional action. First, the European Central Bank's Emergency Committee convened an unscheduled meeting. That type of response doesn't happen because of social media posts. Second, Lloyds of London suspended all new sovereign debt insurance policies for 12 European nations. That represented a $4.2 trillion market that suddenly froze solid. Third, the German Constitutional Court fast-tracked a ruling on their military spending framework. A legal case that had remained dormant for 8 months suddenly received oral arguments scheduled for February 3rd. Institutions don't move with that kind of velocity from a social media post unless something substantial is happening behind closed doors. Here's where the situation becomes prosecutorial. Trump currently faces multiple federal investigations. The January 6th case might be temporarily stalled, but the classified documents case, the obstruction inquiries, and the financial fraud investigations in New York continue grinding forward. And every single one of these cases shares one critical element. They require international cooperation. Deutsche Bank records, Scottish property valuations, Middle Eastern financial flows. They depend on mutual legal assistance treaties, on NATO-level intelligence sharing, on the exact institutional framework Trump just threatened to dismantle. Consider this reality for a moment. A defendant facing multiple federal investigations just declared economic warfare on the very institutions that possess evidence against him. That's not political maneuvering. That's obstruction of justice with a $27 trillion blast radius. From a prosecutor's perspective, they're witnessing a target attempting to burn down the courthouse by threatening the fire department. And the general public is treating it like standard campaign rhetoric. But here's what the mainstream narrative is deliberately not revealing. NATO allies have already begun responding, and not in the manner most people anticipate. On January 25th, just 48 hours following Trump's post, the Netherlands Ministry of Justice did something remarkable. They announced a comprehensive review of all pending United States legal assistance requests. That's Dutch diplomatic language for "we're reconsidering cooperation." The Netherlands isn't just another ally in the Atlantic Partnership. They house the International Criminal Court. They process thousands of American subpoenas annually. They represent a cornerstone of transatlantic legal infrastructure. When they apply the brakes, that signals a 5-alarm emergency for federal prosecutors. Then France's finance minister provided an interview to Le Monde that every Department of Justice attorney should have committed to memory by now. He stated, and this is a direct translation, France will continue to honor treaties with partners who honor their commitments to us. Read that statement again carefully. That's not a routine policy statement. That's a conditional clause, and what effectively amounts to a mutual legal assistance treaty renegotiation. They're communicating clearly. You want our cooperation? Stop threatening our security. And here's the element that should cause prosecutors to lose sleep at night. Germany's Federal Intelligence Service leaked information, and yes, it was absolutely a deliberate leak. They revealed they're reevaluating intelligence, sharing protocols with nations that demonstrate unreliable alliance commitments. That's targeting data. That's financial intelligence. That's the evidentiary backbone of transnational fraud investigations. Now, why does this development matter from a legal standpoint? Because Trump isn't merely a political figure anymore. He's a defendant in multiple active cases, and defendants don't receive permission to dismantle the evidence-gathering apparatus while they're under investigation. If any ordinary citizen were facing federal charges and they threatened the institutions holding evidence against them, prosecutors would file an emergency motion with extraordinary speed. They would classify it as witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and abuse of process. But because Trump is executing this strategy through foreign policy channels and a social media platform, everyone's treating it like political theater. Here's what they're deliberately not telling the public. The Department of Justice is monitoring this situation in real time, and they're rapidly running out of legal options to prevent it. Federal prosecutors operate within a framework that most people never see. They depend on an invisible web of international cooperation that took generations to build. And in 72 hours, Trump didn't just threaten that web, he set it on fire while standing in the middle as a defendant. Let observers understand the prosecutorial architecture that's now crumbling in real time. In 2016, the Department of Justice prosecuted a Ukrainian oligarch named Dmytro Firtash. The case required critical evidence from Austria, Cyprus, and the United Kingdom. It took 4 complete years to assemble that evidence, not because the information was extraordinarily complex, but because international legal assistance operates at the glacial speed of diplomatic protocols. When one country introduces even a 6-month delay, criminal cases begin collapsing. Statutes of limitation expire, witnesses vanish or recant testimony, financial trails disappear into offshore mechanisms. The entire prosecutorial structure weakens with every passing month. Now apply that exact reality to Trump's situation. The Manhattan District Attorney, his case against the Trump Organization, required detailed records from Deutsche Bank's Frankfurt headquarters. That request traveled through German federal prosecutors under a mutual assistance treaty signed back in 1986, a treaty that represents decades of carefully negotiated legal cooperation. If Germany decides that treaty has suddenly become negotiable, if they begin deliberately slow-walking requests because the United States is actively threatening their defense infrastructure, that case weakens instantly. The evidentiary foundation starts cracking. The identical logic applies to Scotland, where Trump's golf courses face financial scrutiny. It applies to Panama, to Dubai, to every single jurisdiction where Trump-linked entities have operated over the past 4 decades. Prosecutors are staring at an unprecedented nightmare, a defendant who possesses the capability to weaponize foreign policy in order to obstruct his own investigations. And here's the historical precedent that should alarm every legal observer. In 2019, President Erdogan of Turkey faced United States sanctions over his military operations in Syria. What did he do in response? He threatened to shut down Incirlik Air Base, a NATO facility absolutely critical to American operations throughout the Middle East. The sanctions were watered down within weeks. That's raw leverage. That's precisely how powerful defendants negotiate when prosecutors cannot indict them through conventional channels. Trump just absorbed that playbook completely, and he's applying it with surgical precision. Now, pay careful attention to this next element because it's where the constitutional crisis truly begins. The Department of Justice operates under a foundational principle that no individual stands above the law. That's not merely a public relations slogan. It's the institutional bedrock of American justice. But what happens when a defendant possesses the power to threaten the very institutions that enforce that principle? What happens when the target of multiple investigations can directly threaten the evidence-gathering apparatus itself? The DOJ has never confronted that question at this magnitude. They're answering it right now. And from any prosecutor's perspective, the answer isn't remotely reassuring, because the truth is brutally simple. The Department of Justice's power depends entirely on institutional cooperation, both domestically and internationally. Strip that cooperation away, and prosecutors aren't just weakening individual cases, they're dismantling the rule of law itself. France's response revealed the depth of this crisis. Their finance minister's statement wasn't diplomatic courtesy. It was a warning shot across the bow of American prosecutorial power. Honor your commitments to us, or we reconsider honoring ours to you. Now, that's prosecutors being held hostage by foreign policy decisions they cannot control. The Netherlands' announcement carried even deeper implications. When they declared a comprehensive review of pending legal assistance requests, they weren't simply pausing cooperation. They were auditing every single case where American prosecutors depend on Dutch institutional support. That includes financial fraud cases, money laundering investigations, corruption probes, dozens of active prosecutions that suddenly face potential evidentiary collapse. Germany's intelligence sharing revelation struck at something even more fundamental. Financial intelligence doesn't just support prosecutions, it enables them. Without real-time banking data, Without telecommunications intercepts, without the sophisticated intelligence apparatus that NATO allies share, transnational fraud cases become nearly impossible to build. Trump didn't accidentally stumble into this strategy. He identified the exact pressure point where prosecutorial power depends on international goodwill. And then he applied maximum pressure. Here's what legal experts are privately acknowledging but won't state publicly. Trump has created a scenario where prosecutors must choose between pursuing accountability and preserving international alliances. That's a fundamentally false choice, but it's devastatingly effective. Because the moment the Department of Justice hesitates, the moment they begin factoring diplomatic blowback into their charging decisions, prosecutorial independence dies. Trump isn't attempting to win in court anymore. He's working to make the courtroom completely irrelevant. And right now, that strategy is succeeding in ways that should terrify anyone who believes institutions matter more than individuals. The prosecutorial apparatus that took 70 years to construct is being dismantled in real time. Not through legal arguments, through a 2:47 a.m. social media post and the calculated chaos that followed. Something happened in those 72 hours that legal scholars will study for decades, not because it was unprecedented in scale, but because it revealed a vulnerability in the American justice system that nobody had seriously considered exploitable. Trump didn't just obstruct justice, he engineered a method for making justice itself optional for the powerful. Let observers examine the second-order consequences that prosecutors are only beginning to comprehend. When Lloyds of London suspended sovereign debt insurance for 12 European nations, that wasn't a financial decision. That was an institutional recognition that the transatlantic alliance had become an uninsurable risk. Insurance markets don't freeze $4.2 trillion in exposure over political rhetoric. They freeze when actuaries calculate that fundamental assumptions about stability no longer hold. Think about what that means practically. European governments suddenly couldn't secure insurance for their debt obligations. Banks couldn't hedge their sovereign exposure. Pension funds holding European bonds watched their risk models collapse overnight. But here's the element that connects directly to Trump's legal jeopardy. Those same financial institutions hold the documentary evidence that prosecutors need for transnational fraud cases. Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, BNP Paribas. Every major European financial institution that has processed Trump Organization transactions over 4 decades. When those institutions face existential uncertainty about the transatlantic alliance, their cooperation with American law enforcement becomes negotiable. Not because they want to obstruct justice, but because their primary obligation shifts to institutional survival. A bank facing a potential sovereign debt crisis doesn't prioritize responding to foreign subpoenas. They prioritize liquidity, capital reserves, and regulatory compliance in their home jurisdiction. Trump didn't need those banks to refuse cooperation. He just needed them distracted enough to slow their responses by 6 months, maybe 12, long enough for statutes of limitation to become a factor. Long enough for witnesses to reconsider their testimony. Long enough for financial trails to grow cold. That's not obstruction through direct action. That's obstruction through engineered chaos. And here's where this becomes a blueprint rather than an isolated incident. Every future defendant with sufficient power is now watching this playbook unfold. They're observing that if you possess leverage over international institutional frameworks, you can effectively immunize yourself from prosecution. Not through legal defenses, not through courtroom arguments, through making the evidence-gathering process itself collapse under geopolitical weight. Consider the precedent this establishes. A billionaire facing fraud charges in New York now knows. Threaten the international banking system, create enough institutional chaos, and prosecutors lose their evidence base. A CEO under investigation for money laundering understands if you can destabilize the mutual legal assistance treaties, the case against you weakens automatically. This isn't theoretical, it's happening in observable real time. The German Constitutional Court's decision to fast-track their military spending case wasn't coincidental. It was a direct signal that Germany was reconsidering its entire relationship with American institutional frameworks, including law enforcement cooperation. That case had been dormant for 8 months. Suddenly, it received oral arguments scheduled within 11 days of Trump's post. That's German federal institutions sending a message. You want to make our defense commitments negotiable? We'll make your prosecutorial requests negotiable. Federal judges in the United States are watching this dynamic with growing alarm, though few will articulate it publicly, because they're recognizing a truth that undermines judicial authority at its core. Courts can issue subpoenas. They can hold defendants in contempt. They can sanction obstruction of justice. But they cannot compel foreign governments to honor mutual legal assistance treaties. They cannot force international banks to prioritize American prosecutorial requests over their own survival. If the evidence exists overseas and the defendant controls the diplomatic pressure points, what exactly is a federal judge supposed to do? Judges are accustomed to enforcing compliance through the power of the state, but the power stops at national borders. Beyond those borders, judicial authority depends entirely on diplomatic cooperation. And diplomatic cooperation can be withdrawn, or delayed, or made conditional on factors that have nothing to do with justice. Trump has exposed that vulnerability with precision that suggests careful planning. He didn't accidentally discover that threatening NATO would create prosecutorial complications. He identified the exact mechanism through which international evidence gathering depends on alliance stability, and then he destabilized that alliance. Here's what keeps legal experts awake at night. This isn't just about Trump anymore. It is about whether the American legal system can maintain accountability for powerful individuals when those individuals possess the tools to dismantle international cooperation. Because if accountability depends on the goodwill of foreign governments, it's not actually accountability. It's negotiation. And you cannot negotiate the rule of law. Either institutions enforce it universally, or they surrender it selectively. Right now, the world is watching that choice play out, not in a courtroom, but in the institutional chaos that followed a single social media post published at 2:47 in the morning. The prosecutors understand what's happening. They're simply running out of legal mechanisms to stop it. The constitutional crisis isn't coming. It's already here. And most people don't recognize it because it doesn't look like previous constitutional crises in American history. There are no tanks in the streets, no dramatic courtroom showdowns, no constitutional conventions being called. Instead, there's something far more insidious happening. The erosion of institutional authority through calculated diplomatic sabotage. Let observers understand what this moment actually represents for the future of American governance. Trump's 2:47 a.m. post accomplished something that no defendant in American legal history has ever achieved. He forced prosecutors to choose between pursuing justice and maintaining international alliances. And the moment that choice exists, prosecutorial independence has already been compromised. Because here's the fundamental truth that legal scholars are grappling with privately. The Department of Justice's power has always rested on an assumption that went unquestioned for generations, the assumption that evidence gathering operates independently of foreign policy considerations. That assumption is now shattered. When prosecutors in the Southern District of New York are building a financial fraud case, they're now forced to consider whether their subpoena requests to European banks might trigger diplomatic retaliation. When the Manhattan District Attorney's Office seeks property valuation records from Scotland, they must calculate whether that request might strain Atlantic alliance relationships. That's not prosecutorial independence. That's prosecutorial hostage-taking. And Trump has demonstrated the exact methodology for any future powerful defendant to exploit. Think about the generational implications. A senator under investigation for corruption now understands. If you chair the Foreign Relations Committee, you possess leverage over the international cooperation that prosecutors need. A defense contractor facing fraud charges recognizes if your company produces weapon systems for NATO allies, you can threaten supply chain disruptions that make your prosecution geopolitically inconvenient. This isn't speculation about potential future abuse. This is the logical extension of the precedent being established right now. The judiciary faces an even more existential problem. Federal judges have spent their entire careers operating under the principle that court orders carry enforceable weight. But what happens when the evidence they've ordered produced exists beyond their jurisdictional reach, and the defendant can manipulate the diplomatic relationships that make evidence transfer possible? A judge can hold someone in contempt for refusing to comply with a subpoena. But a judge cannot hold the German government in contempt for slow-walking a mutual legal assistance treaty request. They cannot sanction the Netherlands for conducting a comprehensive review of American prosecutorial cooperation. Judicial authority ends where diplomatic sovereignty begins, and Trump has weaponized that boundary with devastating effectiveness. Here's what the next 12 months will reveal. Other defendants in high-profile cases will begin testing this exact strategy. They'll identify the international pressure points in their own prosecutions. They'll use whatever leverage they possess, whether it's business relationships, political connections, or economic threats, to destabilize the evidence-gathering process. And prosecutors will find themselves increasingly powerless to respond through traditional legal mechanisms. The Department of Justice is already adapting, though they cannot publicly acknowledge the adaptation. They're prioritizing cases that depend solely on domestic evidence. They're avoiding investigations that require extensive international cooperation unless the evidence is absolutely ironclad and already secured. That's not strategic prosecution. That's defensive prosecution. And defensive prosecution means powerful defendants are already calculating which laws they can violate as long as the evidence trail crosses international borders. The rule of law doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes gradually as enforcement becomes selective, as certain individuals recognize they've moved beyond accountability, as institutions acknowledge privately what they cannot admit publicly. That erosion is happening now. NATO allies aren't going to openly announce they're refusing cooperation with American law enforcement. They'll simply introduce procedural delays They'll cite domestic legal complexities. They'll require additional documentation. They'll slow walk requests until cases weaken naturally through the passage of time. And Trump will have achieved what no defense attorney ever could through courtroom arguments. He'll have made prosecution functionally impossible without ever winning a single legal motion. Here's the question that will define the next era of American governance. Can a legal system designed for the rule of law survive when defendants possess the power to dismantle the institutional frameworks that enforce accountability? Because right now, the answer appears to be no. The prosecutors know it. The judges sense it. The international allies are signaling it through their carefully worded diplomatic responses. What happened in the 72 hours after Trump's 2:47 a.m. post wasn't just about NATO funding or alliance politics. It was a stress test of whether American institutions can hold powerful people accountable when those people control the levers of international cooperation. The test results are coming in, and they should terrify anyone who believes that justice should apply equally regardless of power, wealth, or political position. The courtroom is becoming irrelevant, not because judges lack authority, but because the evidence never arrives. That's not a legal system. That's a legal illusion, and the illusion is crumbling in real time.